most of my career, of course, has been in the city as a financial economist, an economic researcher. So really, that is my core skill. And of course, I'm also a published military historian as well. So I've got a couple of strings to my bow on these matters. Also, just to tidy up on that, it was the Conservative Association of Cambridge University who invited me to speak. It was Cambridge University that stopped me speaking. It was the university faculty.
Terrible.
And broadly, what I intend to say tonight was what I was going to say in that lecture at Cambridge University 2 years ago, at the request of the Conservative University Association, where I had spoken before, in all fairness. So anyway, I'll embark, and there is my website, which carries a lot of articles. So what I say tonight can be caught up with on my website. There is a published article which is reposted on my website on the role of the state, which is, I think, the main thing and the main thrust of what I say tonight. And of course, I'll take as many questions as there is time for, and I'm happy to do that. And greetings to everybody down there in London. It's been some time since I've got down to London, to my club, which I love, for a few beers with my nephew, who's an underwriter at Lloyd's, and I wish you all well down there. So I'll embark on this little talk. I'd be interested to get your feedback on it. The role of government. Now, the role of government has grown and grown and grown over, I would suggest, just a little bit over 100 years. So the role of government has crept, its mission creep, if you will. And this is one of the things that I find I'm very uncomfortable with, because I'm what they call an Austrian school economist, and I'm a libertarian. So I want as little government in my life as possible. I want as low taxes as possible. I want as little regulation as possible. And if you go back to the great, Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, who was probably the greatest Tory Prime Minister of all time, his view was, and I quote Lord Salisbury, the role of Parliament is to facilitate the entrepreneurial spirit of the British people. That is the role of government. Now, that's changed dramatically. That has now become unrecognizable to this Conservative administration. Unrecognizable. Now, the question is, how did it start and how did we get here? And I think we need a sort of political audit trail, as it were. So if we go back, I think, to the time of Lord Salisbury, whose view was very libertarian, very laissez-faire, and another quote from Lord Salisbury was he wanted to form the Mind Your Own Business Society. And I think no modern politician today would even understand that, because they think everything is their business. They can't keep this out of every aspect of our business. And I find that very frustrating as a free-born Englishman. So let's rewind then, not necessarily to the administration of Lord Salisbury, but to counterintuitively the administration of Bismarck in Germany around about the same period. The Prussian Empire, the New Germany, which was run by Bismarck, who was totally hostile to any form of democracy. And he knew that something didn't fit easily with the Germans is democracy, and it hasn't done really for 100 years. They're not really comfortable with that aspect of governmental system. But also Bismarck knew that he had to offer something more than just a militaristic autocracy. He knew he had to do that in order to stave off a potential revolution, which of course was brewing all the time at that time in Russia. So he knew that what he had to do was bring about some form of social support for the German people of that period. And he brought in things like a form of social security and a form of pension payment by the state. This was picked up by Lloyd George, who thought this was a very good idea. And of course, he introduced the concept of pensions for the electorate, and he forced that through for those schoolboys who'd had a traditional education, or when they were at school had a traditional education in 1911, to produce a state pension scheme. And of course, when he introduced that, the life expectancy was probably round about 67, indeed, if that, and the retirement age was 65. So the state was only expected to pay pensions for a couple of years. We now have a system now where it's only just moved to 67, but we have a national pension scheme that has moved to being paid at 67 with a life expectancy at 67 of nearly 80 years old. And so that makes it extremely expensive. Now, of course, let's look at if we fast forward on that, we go from the time of Lloyd George with the first concession, perhaps, in his liberal administration, when liberal meant liberal, the liberal, classical liberal of Gladstone, not the sort of nutcases now that inhabit places like Washington or the Liberal Democrat Party, who aren't liberal at all. So this is how we move forward to this. And in 1942, 1943, in the war years, in the darkest war years, Beveridge came up, the Beveridge report came up with a system of what we recognized as modern, now would recognize broadly as modern welfarism. Now, modern welfarism was based on paying a stamp, your national insurance stamp, and it's still called a stamp today, although it has lost its meaning. Your national insurance is just a tax today, national insurance stamp. So if you paid your national insurance stamp, you were entitled to medical health, a state pension, and state protection if you fell on hard times. And the concept was of Beveridge that it was a safety net underneath the people. It was a safety net for people who had fallen on hard times through no fault of their own. There was no concept at the time that it would be come one, come one, come all. In 1953, the welfare state broadly became come one, come all, and had nothing to do with what you contributed. It was only what you wanted to get out of the system. And of course, it became, and as it is today, a form of lifestyle choice. So if you have enough children and enough rent to pay and bits and pieces, you can almost get as much sitting at home as you can as your next door neighbor who goes to a factory every morning, who may only have one child or perhaps no children. So the system has been completely destroyed. And welfarism, I would argue, in its current form, is the cancer in the nation's soul. It's immoral to pay people to not work. Now, if you go back to the 19th century, there was the concept of self-help. So people formed the mutual societies and the friendly societies, and they paid their shilling a week or whatever it was, and the Beveridge report was based on this, and they paid in, and if they fell on hard times, the friendly society would look after them, and that was the mutual societies, the building societies, so on and so forth. And that was growing apace through the 19th century, right up through the Industrial Revolution. And it was very useful because it meant the only recipients of this benefit were people who'd contributed to it and people who'd generally fallen on hard times. It also didn't take away people's dignity. Welfarism today is a form of state charity, and it takes away people's dignity, and especially if it's the young and the fit and the recipients. Nobody minds the old and infirm through no fault of their own getting benefits. That's not the issue. But it can't be right in a society where the young and the fit do actually nothing to get their money. And this concept of the growing economies of the Far East, and I worked in Hong Kong for a while, is unknown. The concept of paying fit, healthy people, the concept of paying them to do nothing is unknown in the Far East, which is why their GDP grows at a significantly faster rate than ours. We have carrying the burden of a welfare state in the Western Hemisphere, and this includes to a very large extent the United States. So how did this become the norm? How did this become the norm? Well, of course, if you look at the run-up to 1945, if you look at the run-up to 1945, we see that we had the Great War, the terrible depression of the 1930s, and then the Second War. And of course, my grandfather, who was injured on the Messine Ridge, used to get very cross if you ever called it World War I and World War II. There was one war. It just came in two parts. And this was the problem. So you had a generation that had gone through the horrific casualties of the Great War, then the Depression throughout the 1930s, then the next generation went through another war. So the khaki election of 1945 offered something new. People wanted something different. They'd fed up with the old ways. And Herbert Spencer, the 19th century philosopher, said all old systems of government eventually die. And we're seeing that today. I'll come back to Herbert Spencer in a minute. He was a very popular philosopher in the 19th century. So in 1945, the general view was from the repatriating soldiers and sailors, and those people who had worked very hard in the munitions industry, came back and said, we want something new, something different. And then Clem Attlee came along with his socialist ideas. And make no mistake, in 1945, the Attlee administration was very heavily socialist. It wasn't New Labour. It had nothing to do with the likes of people like Tony Blair. It was rabid socialist, that administration, with tax rate at 90% and nationalisation of all the industries, so on and so forth. So it was a very, very heavy socialistic regime. And that's when welfare eventually changed to come one, come all by the 1953, around about 1953. And the nation, of course, slumped. The economy slumped. And we were overtaken by Germany, who adopted a completely different position under a man called Ludwig Erhard, who brought forward, after years in Germany of National Socialism, he brought forward a very much more flexible regime of a very much laissez-faire approach to running an economy. And of course, on the other side of the world, if you look at Hong Kong, you'll find that John Cooperthwaite, who ran the territories post-war, where don't forget, Hong Kong has no natural resources at all. All it had basically was a harbour. Absolutely fascinating. And post-war, over decades, Hong Kong became one of the most prosperous places on the face of the planet. And GDP per capita shot up. I was there when some of that happened, when it was territories, when it was a British colony. Fascinating. And the trouble is, at school today, children aren't taught about John Cooperthwaite and how successful that regime is. And of course, when Singapore went its own way after the collapse of the empire, he didn't run a laissez-faire organization, admittedly, but he ran a very tight economy based on production and not freebies for all. So Singapore then became an extremely successful place. So we say a laissez-faire type of economy in post-war Germany, post-empire Singapore, and post-war Hong Kong was extremely successful. And as a very strong campaigner for Brexit, I was hoping that when we shook off Brussels and the bureaucracy of Brussels, that we would leap forward running an economy on a laissez-faire basis. And of course, what we actually see is Boris, who conned us all at the election by looking like a genial soul who was a laid-back sort of laissez-faire guy and would have a light hand on the tiller. Now he's turned into what can only be described as a fascist. Now, I do not use the term fascist in a pejorative sense, all right? That's the sort of thing that NUS students shout. Fascism is a system of government based on the Italian system of fascisti in the 1920s and the early 1930s under Benito Mussolini. And the concept is, and there's an article on fascism on my website, basically fascism controls production. In the same way the communist system actually owns production, fascism controls production. Excuse me. And this is what we had in the European Union, and this is what we have now. We have, everything is highly regulated. We have DEFRA, we have Ofcom, we have Quangos, we have employment legislation which tells small businessmen or medium-sized businessmen how many hours their staff can work. How much holiday that they can have, all sorts of regulations for small and medium-sized business to employ people. The state gets its neb end in almost everywhere. And of course, that stifles an economy. It stifles entrepreneurial spirit, which I was talking about from the early days of Lord Salisbury. So Parliament is actually doing exactly what Lord Salisbury said don't do. But you've got to remember, in 1945, it looked extremely attractive. It looked very attractive to a war-weary nation with the background that they'd had in that century for the last 50 years. When the government said, look, what we will do, we'll look after your social security, your health, your pensions, your education. We'll do the whole thing for you. We'll take away all that heavy responsibility from you. And everybody thought, well, that's nice, that's good, we'll go for that because it sounds extremely attractive. But of course, what's come with that, the baggage that has come with that, is the government feel that it's their right or responsibility or privilege, call it whatever you like, to do two things. That is to control everybody's lives, micromanage everybody's lives and everybody's businesses, and detach themselves from all that goes with that. So you find that public sector pensions and politicians' pensions and bureaucrats' pensions are all index linked. That is impossible now in the private sector. Index linking is impossible. Public sector and civil servants are virtually unsackable. It's still virtually 9 till 5 and a CBE at the end of it if you're senior enough, an OBE if you're not. So this business about everybody being in it together simply isn't true. It isn't true. There's them and us. And the divide is getting bigger and bigger. And the Institute of Economic Affairs suggested only last year that if you're working in the public sector, broadly speaking, if you take salaries and pensions and everything into consideration, you're around about 12% better off in the public sector than you are in the private sector. So we now have to look at actually what keeps the economy afloat. What keeps the economy afloat, of course, is 80% of the GDP of this country is not big business. It's small businesses, the self-employed, and middle-sized companies. It's what the economy is. It's the butcher, the baker, the hairdresser, the cab driver. That is the economy. Which always used to amuse me of Brexit. What are we going to do if we leave the European Union? It's only a tiny amount of trade that we have backwards and forwards to the European Union. It's actually very small. It's a tiny percentage, probably about 7, 8, 9% of our trade and our economy has anything to do with selling anything. They sell us plenty. They sell us plenty, but we didn't really ever sell them very much. So we have to understand what an economy is. And of course, our biggest trading partner as an individual country, of course, is the United States. These numbers don't lie. You have to look at the numbers, but the trouble is numbers aren't convenient for people with political dogma. So we have to understand where the government's coming all the time. And now we've even got to a situation where they tell us what can go on the shelves at Tesco. They can tell us whether there should be sweeties on the Tesco checkout, so on and so forth, how much we should eat or not eat or drink, or fat or thin we should be. This is not the role of government. This isn't the role. This shouldn't be the role of government. It's none of their bloody business. If the landlord says it's all right to have a smoke in the pub, it's the landlord's responsibility. Now, I'm not a smoker, but the decision is between the landlord and his customer. If I want to recruit somebody into my business, I'm a director of 1 or 2 companies still, if I want to recruit somebody, we sit down under contract law. We sit down under contract law and come to an arrangement where I will pay him XYZ salary, the terms of it is a month's notice on either side. I don't want a politician sitting around the table making that difficult for me, because the more difficult they make it and the more they come in with increasing livable, what they call a livable wage, it means that the less likely is small businesses and medium-sized businesses are going to recruit people. Which is why when you go to your local co-op or Tesco, there's lines and lines and lines of self-service machines. They've got rid of all the ladies and gentlemen on the checkout, which of course, up until only 10 years ago, up here in Yorkshire, would be manned by part-time workers late in life. Pensioners would be very happy to get out of the house and do that work for half a day. And now they've been replaced, because by the time that the company has to provide all sorts of bits and pieces for them, somebody comes along and says, why don't we have a self-service system, and you won't have to employ all these people? And of course the shareholders say, well, that's good, but what you've actually done is you haven't improved the service and you haven't made it cheaper. What you've done is just put a lot of people who were quite enjoying topping up their very modest pensions, if they're on a state pension or a private sector pension, very modest, topping that up. Now, I said that I'd come back to the 19th century philosopher, Herbert Spencer, and I'd like to do that now. And because a lot of people watching this, or a lot of undergraduates when I do get to speak at universities when I'm not banned, say, well, how would we do this and how would we do that? And there's this feeling amongst the generation, post-war generation, that are now at university, that are my grandchildren's generation, if you will, that the state somehow has to provide all these things, because if the state didn't provide it, it wouldn't be provided. And of course, this is absurd, but generally received wisdom by the academic world today. And this is where, when children go to universities, youngsters go to universities, they're indoctrinated that the state is the holy thing and we need the state. And without the state, we couldn't survive. This, of course, is ludicrous. So Henry Spencer came up with this sort of idea. He was very anti-state. He didn't like the state any more than I do. And we're going back 130 years here. So his idea, his was the original idea. I can't claim the original idea, but what I can do is explain perhaps how I added to this, And I want you to imagine you've got a credit card, or something that looks like a credit card. Or a favored shopper card, a plastic card, and you sign a contract with the state that you don't want anything from the state. You don't want anything from the state, please. I don't want anything you have to offer. But on the alternative is you don't expect anything from me. You can't have any tax. All right, so that's the deal. I don't want anything from you, and you don't want anything from me. And I think that's perfectly fair. Now, just imagine that card. Imagine you have that card in your wallet or in your purse, and how that would affect your life. First of all, you get in the car and you go and drive, and you fill up the car with petrol. Instead of it being £60 to fill up, you don't pay any tax. There's no duty on petrol because you're not in that system. You've opted out. There's your opt-out card. Mask exempt, if you will. I'm exempt from this nonsense. So you can fill your car, you can fill up your tank for £20 or £25 instead of 60, because you're only paying what the oil company charge you. Of course, in the car that you've bought, how interesting is this? If you pay £25,000, let's say for a middle range car, a middle range family vehicle, there's 20% VAT you're not going to pay. So you save £5,000 when you drive that nice shiny new car out of the showroom. So you save there. You stop off on the high street. You need to buy a few bits and pieces. The missus wants you to buy a new frying pan. There's no 20% VAT. You take the missus out to give her a big treat, maybe once every 5 years, which is plenty. And there's no VAT when you settle the bill. And the bottle of wine is half price because there's no duty on it. Your pint of bitter is no longer £4. It's £1.20, because you're not paying all this shit. And your rates, let's say your rates, it's £2.5 grand for me up here, but I don't know, it's London, I don't know where it is, but let's say it's £2.5 grand for me. I don't want any of that. I don't want anything the town hall has to offer me. So that's £2,500 saved. And I work for a local company. And here's my salary chit at the end of the month. Well, marvelous. Let's just say I'm on the average national wage, and let's just say that that's £30,000. There are no deductions. There's no PAYE. There's no national insurance contribution. And the employer then says, well, I was paying 5% in employer tax or 8% employer tax. You can have that now. So your salary actually goes up. Let's say you're a double working household, which most people are these days. Sadly, that's the way the world is. So husband and wife, if on the average national wage, that's £60,000 a year, say, roughly speaking. They keep the whole £60,000 because they've cut the state and the state waste out of their lives. They've cut it out of their lives. So you're now getting £60,000 a year, and everything you buy is significantly cheaper. Well, that's very good, isn't it? That means you can afford private education for your child, and you can afford all sorts of other things like private health care. You can buy your insurance policy for private health. So you don't need anything from the state, but the state can't take anything from you. And so we don't need the state, and we'd be rather better off, because everything the state produces costs us a fortune and is inefficient. And if you look now at the, let's just take, shall we, social care and NHS in England alone. The budget is £220 billion a year. And this is the NHS's government's own figures I'm quoting here. Imagine that, and of course, who's got to pay the £220 billion a year? It can only be the wealth creating sector. And your civil servants aren't in the wealth creating sector. They actually draw money out of the system, they don't put into it. So the £220 billion a year has to be contributed by little people. The hairdresser or the cab driver or the bus driver or whomsoever it may be. They're the ones that actually holding up this thing. And of course, because there isn't enough tax in the wealth creating sector to do it, you have to borrow the money. So what happens, and we've seen this in spades yesterday, with the Chancellor, who has no intention. He made it terribly clear that he has no intention whatsoever of cutting public spending. He's talking about, we voted for him because we wanted all these public services, but you know, it isn't as simple as that. We don't want high-speed rail too. That's 100 billion. We don't want over 200 billion a year in quangos. We don't want that. We don't want to send £1 billion a month away in unaudited foreign aid. So what we're actually losing here, and we're wasting lots and lots of money. Yes, fair enough, we want some things in a public sector service, perhaps, but we don't want to the extent that government is spending now. So they're borrowing and printing money, which degrades the currency. And of course, who does the inflating the currency hurt most? Those on fixed income, those on lower wages, and pensioners. If you're a big cheese and you've got lots of stocks and shares and assets and property, it doesn't affect you. It doesn't affect you. And all this greenery business that comes in, all the greenery stuff, more windmills. Well, the whole world knows now. The whole world knows that wind turbines don't work. We all know that. They found out that the hard way in Texas, South Australia, Germany, where there's disaster, they're building conventional power stations very quickly, and the Iberian Peninsula, so on and so forth. But no, we're having more. Now, we didn't vote Green. We didn't vote Green. The Greens got one MP. Most of us didn't vote Green, and yet we're getting Green. It was the same under Cameron. We get Green. It doesn't matter what we vote. We get the same Muppets actually wasting our money. And where the economy could leap forward is if you cut public spending. He could balance the books, you know. He could balance the books virtually overnight. And we haven't had a balanced current account in this country since, for 30 years. And he could do that if he cut out waste and he cut out nonsense. He could do all that. He could get back, and he could cut tax, and he could deregulate. And if he did that, we'd find our economy would leap forward and get the advantages of Brexit that Brexit should offer. But it's beginning to look now, after only a year, what we've actually done, we've exchanged Brussels for Whitehall. And there's some good things in this largest budget, but you know, which is free ports and all that's good. But I don't like the way it's going, and I don't like this concept that it's all right to borrow from our children and our grandchildren all the time. And he's talking about borrowing up until 2026. That's his own words. He's borrowing until 2026. So the national debt on the Conservative Party has doubled in the last 10 years, and it will double again at the rate he's borrowing by 2026. So the national debt just goes up and up and up. The currency becomes degraded, and the only people that actually are protected from this are those in the public sector who are index linked against all this. Most of us are being hung out to dry. And so this is my worry. There's too much government. We don't want it. We need to get rid of it. And we need to really leap forward now that we've got Brexit and a lot of hard work people watching this put into. So what I'll do is I'll wind it up there, and then we can take some questions from anybody who'd like to ask any questions about, not just about what I've just said, I am a graduate of the Royal College of Defence Studies as well. It's a I have a military wing as well as a financial wing. So I'm very happy to answer questions on the current military strategy and NATO as well, should anybody have a question of that nature. And just to reinforce, there's much more flesh on the bones here on my website for detail. For the geeks, and I'm a geek, can't help it, sorry, which is why I've got no mates. If you're a fellow geek and you want to find out, you'll find my website and you can go to exactly where the information is, and it won't be from the government, it won't be from Big Pharma, it won't be from the civil service, it won't be from Bill Gates, it won't be from the World Health Organization. It will be from people all over the world who actually know what they're talking about and have no personal axe to grind.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Godfrey. That was really educational, and I like to have things explained the way that you have done, and I'm sure we'd agree with most of what you've said. First up to ask a question is Jags. Would you like to unmute, Jags? Have you got a question for Godfrey? I'm trying to unmute you. Ah, brilliant. Jags, do you want to ask Godfrey a question?
Yeah. Mr. Bloom, a pleasure to interact with you. My question's very simple. Well, I hope it is. Who owns the Bank of England?
The Bank of England was nationalised in 1949. It was always a private up until then. But of course, we all know they say it's independent now. It's fake. It's political fakery. So although it was nationalised just after the war, it was always joined at the hip with the government of the day, as it still is. If it's the Chancellor of the Exchequer who recruits the governor of the Bank of England, you know exactly who really owns it. And of course, the governors of the Bank of England are selected by the government of the day. So no, they're not independent. The Fed, interestingly enough, to just add a little bit of that, as you probably know, the Fed in 2030, it was instituted, but the Fed, either the Bank of, call it what you like, the Fed, the equivalent of the Bank of England, was actually brought into being in 1913, and it gives the facility of a government-owned central bank, and all central banks are the same: the ECB, the Fed, Bank of Japan. It gives them this wonderful facility to print money, and they print money, and it's usually for war. In 1913, 1914, of course, it was for warfare. And in this country now, it's largely for welfare. They can't raise enough money in tax to pay for the welfare system, so they print the money. And which is why we've seen the degradation of currency, and we see inflation, which is when I was round about your age, by the look of you, a pint of bitter cost a shilling, an old shilling, which is the equivalent to, I think, of 5p or something like that. And today it's nearly £4 in York, where I live very close. It's nearly £4. That's inflation. And of course, it's a tax. What people always think of taxes, they think it's how much they pay in PAYE or national insurance or VAT. Inflation is the biggest tax because they degrade the money. And generally speaking, if you're only getting a 1 or 2% salary increase over any period of time, your spending power, of course, is curtailed drastically, which is why an old geezer like me from the 1950s, from a sort of a Middle England background, wives didn't work at all. I had two sisters. My father went to the city every day, or nearly every day, and he kept the family, paid the mortgage, and we had a holiday and a new car and all that kind of stuff. You can't run a family now unless the wife works. And I think that's a great shame. It's a personal thing because I believe in the family, the strength of the family, and the family as a unit. And I believe I get shot down for this, but mother, because now it's got to be the spouse, or it could be the husband. The mother has a role to play in the home, and I think that's why, in many ways, in the 1950s and early 1960s, the world was rather a better place, not as far as medical science was concerned, so on and so forth. But it was rather a better place to be when it came to family, the way we treat each other, the way we treat old people, so on and so forth. Sorry to ramble on.
No, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Godfrey. Richard Day, did you want to ask a question? So I'm trying to unmute you. Sorry, Richard. Can you unmute?
Yeah, I've done that.
Oh, did you want to ask a question, Godfrey?
Yeah, hi Godfrey.
Which one we got?
Okay. Does Bitcoin stroke cryptocurrency represent financial freedom, or is it a Trojan horse for financial cancel culture?
Very big question, actually, and I'll do my best to answer it as quickly as I can. Cryptocurrency, if it's run by central banks, is a confidence trick, as everything that central banks do is a confidence trick. We have already got cryptocurrency with central banks, the central banking system. If you go into the bank and borrow £20,000 for a car, for example, all they will do is digitally credit your account to buy the car if you're a good risk. It's digital. There aren't any pound notes floating or pound coins flowing about. That's bullshit. So it's digital already. And the reason that we have a problem here is because the degradation of currency. We have a degradation of currency, as I was just talking about. Now, the reason, so state cryptocurrency is a con, but if we're talking about Bitcoin, we're talking about a very interesting concept, because you can't cheat with Bitcoin because there's a finite supply. So nobody could go away and manufacture Bitcoin. And that is the monster difference between the potential central banking cryptocurrency and Bitcoin, and perhaps some of the others on which I'm not an expert. But certainly I own Bitcoin, I hold Bitcoin, but I treat my Bitcoin a little bit like I treat a day at the races. If I take 200 quid to the races, York races up the road, I must be prepared to lose that and have a jolly good day out. Now with Bitcoin, I do the same thing. The money I have there, I'm prepared to lose, or at least if not lose, see move very radically in up and down, very radically up and down. Bitcoin is to hold. You hold Bitcoin as a store of value, but if you have a limited amount of money and you're perhaps older, you're a young man, you could probably afford to hold some Bitcoin because you've got a long path ahead of you. If you're an old geezer like me, or admittedly with a much younger wife, I hold gold in the main for the simple reason that's stood the test of time as a store of value for 5,000 years. And when I'm lecturing when I'm allowed to lecture at universities on this subject, I always hold up a sovereign coin. And the one I hold up happens to have a date of 1905 on it. That's just, there's nothing special about 1905. That's just what it is. And I always make it clear to the undergraduates that this coin, this sovereign gold sovereign coin with King Edward VII's head on it, in 1905, of course, that would buy you bed and breakfast at a reasonably good hotel in London. And it would do that today, because it's around about 350 quid. It's down at the moment, but there's another reason for that, which I won't go into detail with here. But that would still do it today. In 100 years' time, that gold sovereign will buy you bed and breakfast in London again. It isn't an investment, it's money. And JP Morgan said before the Great War, he said, only gold is money. Only gold is money and behaves as money and holds its value as money for 5,000 years. There is nothing else. Silver to a much lesser extent. Silver to a lesser extent. But certainly if you wanted to recommend grandma or even your dad to store of wealth to be absolutely rock solid, put it in a bottom drawer and come back and it will still be worth something, gold sovereigns is where you should be. You perhaps should have a little tickle at Bitcoin if you can afford to a bumpy ride.
Okay, so I realise it's a very wide question with what's the store of value and what's a fluid currency. I think there are other coins that will represent a more fluent currency, and you know, I'm worried about them sort of being able to switch that off. But I know it's a long question that could hog too much of your time. So I thank you for that. And
if you're interested, there is an article on my website which is powered by Going Postal just a few months ago, and it's reproduced there on my website, where I think it's over 1,000 words on Bitcoin. So I elaborate a little bit on that and how it could be attacked in the future, Bitcoin, because most people in the Bitcoin community think that it can't be attacked by the state.
Oh.
And I explained how it could be, and we need to be aware. But I'm pro Bitcoin. I love the concept. I totally adore the concept. It's absolutely right, but not in the hands of central banks.
Good stuff. I'll read that article. Thank you, Godfrey.
Yeah, but don't be afraid to come back to me. If you want to come back to me with a question on my website, I will get around to answering it eventually.
Thank you very much, Godfrey. It's very enlightening because I've heard about Bitcoin so much from people I used to work with, and I must admit I know nothing about it. Mike Shaw wanted to ask you a question. Mike, could you unmute for us? Brilliant. Mike, did you want to ask Godfrey something? Oh, Mike, you've got on mute again. Sorry.
Now, okay. Good evening, Godfrey. Thank you very much. Very enlightening. Particularly interested in the figures that you gave us about the social care. Have you any idea of the numbers of people that are in permanent or semi-permanent receipt of those benefits, and the number of public sector workers in the country?
I can't give you the breakdown just at the moment of the number of people, because the concept of moving NHS and social care together as a statistic is brand new. It's new, and so the amount of information, the amount of data available just at the moment isn't as in depth as it used to be. So I can't remember off the top of my head, but getting the number of people, I don't want to give a wrong figure, and I don't want to guess because I can't remember, but the number of people in the public sector is easily Googled. If you Google that, the Taxpayers Alliance, and I think the Institute of Economic Affairs will give you the exact figure. Sorry, I can't be specific because I just can't remember, but it's far too many.
That's the easy answer. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Godfrey.
While you were speaking, I just worked out that it costs over £3,000 per annum per person. That's including everybody in the country to fund the NHS and social care system.
You are
on the
quite,
figure that you gave us.
Quite right, Mike. You are quite right. That figure is exactly right. And the interesting thing is, if you take the entire country, you're talking about, one might argue, any individual from 2 or 3 years old to 60 years old don't require any of that. So you're talking about that going to a very small number of people. So that's a huge budget going to a very small percentage of the population, which is fascinating in its own right. And you also then, and I haven't done this because I haven't had time, but I will be doing the number of how many people work in the wealth creating sector to support that figure, because that's the important thing. How many people go to work? So that means 17 or 18 years old to round about 60 years old in the private sector go to work in order to support that huge cost. And that's another fascinating statistic, which I will have in a week or two.
Thank you very much, Godfrey. Tris, did you want to ask a question? Could you unmute, please, Tris? Oh, sorry. Tris, can you unmute?
There you go.
Thank you, Tris.
Excuse the eating, it's not me, it's my dog in the background. Yeah, hi Godfrey from up the road in the Walls. I just wondered if you use or invest in any other cryptocurrencies such as Monero, or if it's just strictly Bitcoin that you are involved in.
It's only Bitcoin, and there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is I do consider myself an expert on gold and fixed interest, which I managed for many years for pension funds. In fact, I did actually win some prizes doing that. And my golden rule really over many years is to don't open your trap if you don't really understand something or know something any depth, because sooner or later somebody will come and catch you out and it will bite you in the bum. I have done a reasonable amount of research on Bitcoin, and I'm fairly comfortable about the implications of Bitcoin, and I've written on Bitcoin. I'm by no means an expert on other cryptocurrencies, and it would therefore be totally inappropriate for me to comment.
Okay. I would suggest having a good look at Monero. It is
thank you, and I most certainly will.
Basically Bitcoin with privacy and security on it.
I will certainly look, and thank you for the tip.
No problem.
Thank you, Tris, and thank you very much, Godfrey. Mike Farish, would you like to ask a question? Could you come off mute, please?
Hello, Godfrey. Interesting listening to you. A Lancastrian to a Yorkshireman. I'm actually talking to you from deepest, darkest southeast London, Lewisham, and you mentioned the Beveridge report, and I believe it was actually written about 3 miles down the road from me in Elton Palace, which is a Swiss Art Deco house built with inherited money. I'm sure there's an irony there of some sort. But you took the long view. You went right back to Bismarck, but you go back 30 odd years, about 35 years. Of course, Britain had a prime minister who would probably agree with you, Margaret Thatcher. What do you think went wrong there? Was she sort of ambushed and snuffed out by a cabal of corporatists in her own party? I mean, what are your feelings about her?
Well, as soon as she selected her cabinet, I knew that she was going to eventually be in trouble. She didn't select, and this was a great mistake that she made, she didn't select a radical cabinet. It was full of the same old tired Tory journeyman politicians, with one or two exceptions, but very few. Certainly not enough to carry any serious radical reform through, for which the country was crying out then as it is now. So what Maggie Thatcher's administration did basically was put her finger to a certain extent in the dike to stop things getting worse for a decade or so. And thank her for that. You know, yes, well done her. And certainly if she'd still been here today, she certainly wouldn't be putting up with the kind of nonsense that we're putting up with today. That is quite true. But she simply didn't have a radical cabinet. I think if I remember rightly, and you might remember, Sir Keith Joseph was a radical, but he was snuffed out. Radical thinking wasn't allowed. And of course, there is a phenomenon that we all understand in this country, anybody who understands politics, that the National Health Service, for example, is treated in this country much the same as the sacred cow is on the Indian subcontinent. You simply cannot criticize the NHS. You politically, it's poison. Most people who look into it, who know about it, who think about it, know that the NHS is an anachronism, it's a dinosaur, it's incompetent, it's dire. But political criticism of it, because they think you're being nasty to that nice nurse who was so kind to their mother when she died. And that's what people get in their mind. What they don't get in their mind, and I hope they will do one day, is out of 1.2 million people who work for the National Health, less than half have any medical qualification whatsoever, less than half. I know you need some technicians and administrators and a few bits and pieces, but it begs the question, what do they all do? How is it that the average national salary of somebody in hospital administration is 70,000 and a theatre nurse, fully trained theatre nurse, is 32,000? Somebody answer me that. Why is it that if you buy on prescription, the National Health pays more for paracetamol than it does if you go into Tesco's and buy it? The procurement policy is dire. The levels of management in the National Health Service is dire. The whole thing about the National Health is rotten to the core. However, you try and say that politically, you just won't get elected.
Well, thank you, Godfrey. I've actually got a question about the whole medical profession, because, for instance, lately we've just been told about losing weight to protect yourself from coronavirus, about changing your diet to reverse diabetes, about hygiene, protecting us from various viruses. These are things that we used to all know many years ago. I mean, I always look back to the 80s as a golden time, and I remember the things that my mum taught me when I was a child, basic things. And when I was at school, nobody was fat. It just seems that we now want everybody to be sick. We give them lots of expensive medicine. It has lots of side effects. We give them more medicine, and we just seem to be in a just total mess. Why do you think that's been allowed to happen? Or why has that been propagated? It's just very, I've watched it happen, and I find it very depressing. It's almost as if we're never going to be told the truth about anything unless we find out for ourselves, and it gets to the point where we have to be told.
you're absolutely right. Janice, you're absolutely right. For my sins, I seem to have had a lot of jobs in my life, don't I? If you look at them, I finished my career actually in the city as the chief executive of a life insurance company. So I've seen this come on and go on for several decades. And I also was working in a consultancy actuarial practice for several years. So I know how to actually read the numbers and look at a situation, whether it's, pandemic, epidemics, scares, HIV. I lived through all the HIV kind of stuff, and I was part of, the underwriting because of my role in life insurance industry. What you need to do, what doesn't happen and what should happen, and you're quite right in what you say, let's just take what we're dealing with now. Let's just take coronavirus. Just let's pick on that because it's topical today. Coronavirus. Well, if you look at the mortality statistics, where there is no comorbidity, so we're looking at somebody who may have died or has COVID-19 written on the death certificate, nothing else. That's all that killed them. That's all that killed them. You'll find that the number is under 5,000, not the 100,000. The people that told us. Now, that isn't my figure. That is the Office of National Statistics. You'll find it on my website. All right. That is not an imagined figure. That is what they tell us. And we all know, and I can't believe people watching at the moment haven't had a similar experience. My friend Brian, who I was at prep school with, he died of pancreatic cancer in Farnborough Hospital 4 weeks ago. And he was only there for the last 3 or 4 days of his life, but he was tested positive. He was one of the 100,000 that Boris was telling us about. Now, he died of pancreatic cancer. He didn't die of COVID. So what they're doing is they're cheating and lying when it comes to the mortality protocols. We know that if you were tested positive within 28 days and you die in hospital, it goes on the death certificate. It becomes one of the 100,000. We also know that what would have gone down as flu, as pneumonia, goes down as COVID. Isn't it fascinating that if you check the statistics with Public Health England, nobody this year died of flu? What annoys me is, Janice, that they seem to think we're stupid. They seem to think we're stupid. My wife is ex-NHS. She's a chartered physiotherapist, much younger than me, but she done NHS. She's got a private practice now and so on and so forth. However, she was stunned when we had these infections in hospitals because the protocols and the disciplines, when she in the 70s, in the late 70s and the 80s, wearing a uniform in and out of the hospital precinct, so on and so forth, and your attitude to hygiene within the ward, and your concept of hands-on nursing and experienced nurses. And she would argue the concept of having a degree in nursing is more than ludicrous, it's absurd. But that's the way it's going. So you've got people who are academic nurses, instead of rolling their sleeves up and doing what they would see. We all love Doctor at Sea or Doctor in Law or all those lovely films where the NHS was getting Lancelot Spratt and all that kind of thing. We loved all that. That was when the disciplines worked. And now, of course, that was all thrown to the wind. And of course, what we've also got is this ludicrous situation where they virtually closed the National Health Service down. If it's not COVID, they're not interested. And they've spent billions on track and trace, which we know is incompetent and wrong. We know the testing system is wrong. We know that doesn't work because the inventor of it told us. The manufacturers of it told us it doesn't work. The false positives. They've thrown billions of pounds at it. And yet, wouldn't that be better on testing men for prostate cancer and women for breast cancer, which are real killers? Because we know with COVID-19, if you're physically fit and under 65, or under 70, your recovery rate is 99%. Nobody is dying of COVID if you're fit and healthy. And yet we've closed the country and we've virtually closed down the NHS. This, in my opinion, is one of the biggest scams that the country's ever seen. And it's going on globally, which leads me again to believe this is not about public health. This is about something else. Who owns the World Health Organization? Big Pharma. This is all about Big Pharma. This is why your GP gives you a drug before he's even examined you, is because it's all about Big Pharma. And if you look at the shares, who's made money out of the last 10 months? Big Pharma. We're talking about billions and billions and billions of pounds in shareholders. Who owns the shares? Chris Whitty and Pat Vallance. We know they own shares in Big Pharma. They're advising Boris. And we know Boris is the moron. So consequently, the whole thing rolls on, doesn't it? The people getting screwed are ordinary people picking up the tab in the wealth creating sector. It's scandalous, but I can't see it stopping until somebody has the balls to stand up and say enough's enough.
Yeah. Thank you, Godfrey. I've got another quick question. I think all of us would agree and secretly know what you've just said. But I'm guessing, I know we hate the furlough scheme, but I'd love to know what you think about it and what you think, how you think this is going to end. When is this mess? Is it going to explode and end, or is it going to drag on for years until there's no money left?
Well, it depends whether you regard this as being anything to do with health or whether you think it's part of a bigger reset picture. There are two schools of thought. Is it a cock up or is it a conspiracy? I don't know. It depends when you catch me. How I wake up one morning, I think it's a conspiracy. Another morning, I think it's a cock up. But how can you have the Prime Minister saying that we should be free by June and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and they work cheek by jowl, saying he's extending furlough system to September? They're both singing off different hymn sheets. It doesn't make any sense at all. But let's have a look around the world. Let's have a look at the statistics, for example, in Sweden, where they've had no lockdown whatsoever. They haven't gone down this lockdown route at all. And you'll find that the mortality statistics are no better or no worse than they are in the United Kingdom. They're slightly better, actually, but I won't nitpick. If you look at, for example, Florida, take the States of America, and their economies and populations are the biggest, most countries in Europe. If you look at Florida, they haven't had a lockdown, they haven't gone all this, and the mortality statistics around about the middle of the pack. New York, where they locked down viciously, the mortality statistics are much worse. Let's look at Texas. Texas has just got rid of the whole damn nonsense. They've just gone back because it believes if you have an aerosol virus, whether you believe that standing 6 feet away from somebody is going to stop you getting it. Well, if you take a walk down the fields in and around my little village in springtime and they're spraying, I can smell the spray that they're spraying the crops from a mile away. Even if there's not very much wind, even if there's I can smell it. If you think you're not going to get this by standing in front or standing with, outside 6 feet away from somebody, you're living in la la land. If you think a piece of face nappy is going to stop you getting anything, a virus, people don't seem to understand what a virus is. That's like keeping mosquitoes out with chicken wire. It can't possibly work. And a lot of you would have seen the they would have seen the clip of the guy vapor. He's smoking a vapor, right? And he puts his mask down. I don't know whether you see it. It's on YouTube, and it goes everywhere. The idea that this face diaper is going to save anybody, but everybody's walking around muzzled because it's got nothing to do with health and safety. Because at the beginning of this, Janice, at the beginning of this, they told us masks don't work. The WHO said masks don't work. We know masks don't work. Now suddenly they're compulsory. This isn't about health. This is about subjecting the population to compliance. This is compliance. I'm wearing a mask. I'm compliant with the state. Why would they do that? Well, your guess is as good as mine. But I think there's something nasty coming down the road. I can't see us ever giving this up. It seems to me that they hate pubs. They hate pubs. Not just this administration, it's not just coronavirus. They've been closing pubs, they've been making pubs. And why do they hate pubs? Why have pubs been closing for the last 30 years? Because the governments of the day have made it very difficult for pubs to succeed and make a profit. Why don't they like pubs? Well, a pub is where everybody gets together, regardless of their social background, their profession, what they do for a living, and exchange ideas in a convivial, fun environment. That's a pub. That's the wonderful of the institution of a British pub. And that's why they don't like it. We have to be at home listening to the BBC propaganda and drinking our booze from Sainsbury's, who contribute to Labour Party or Conservative Party funds. That's what it's all about. They hate freedom of association. This is why we're not allowed to demonstrate. The police turn into thugs in London, in Hyde Park, when people go and say, give us our freedom back, which is our freeborn right as English people under the Bill of Rights, under Magna Carta, under the Toleration Act. All these things, they're crushing, which is why I come back to say what we have now is a fascist environment and I don't use the term pejoratively, I say this is what we're living under now. Boris Johnson is a fascist. He believes in fascism. He believes in control of the population. He doesn't believe in freedom of the individual, and he believes in tightly controlling industry. That's fascism.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, am I on mute? Hold on. Let me come up. Sorry, I'm not on mute. Sorry. Thank you, Godfrey. I think most people on here would thoroughly agree with what you've just said and feel thankful that you've said it. Peter Harper stuck his hand up. I know Peter's very passionate. Would you like to ask the question, Peter? And could you...
Hi,
Peter?
Janice. My
Hi.
reputation is spread then. That's good.
Got a question for Godfrey?
Yes, I have. Yeah, with regard to what you said, I'm glad that you said that, Godfrey. And just further to that, I really can't see how there can be any kind of doubts about it, that this is the Great Reset. From everything I've read about it, from what is openly stated about the Great Reset, its aims and the means by which those aims are to be achieved. Are you familiar with that? Klaus Schwab's Great Reset under the World Economic Forum's plan? Do you have? You said before that you sway between essentially believing that and believing that it's gross mismanagement by the government. Surely no one is that stupid as the government. I mean, I don't believe the government are that stupid that they would be following this plan without adherence to what is obviously a globalist agenda, because it's happening across the world. The way the police are approaching people, there's a standard approach of about 6 police officers taking someone to the ground, and then a line of police standing in front to stop people from filming it. That seems to be everywhere. You see these videos everywhere. Closing small businesses, keeping them shut down. You can buy clothes in the big shops. You can buy stuff online, of course. But you can't buy stuff in small shops. They're closed. They're forced into a position where private business is destroyed, and therefore the means by which people can earn an independent income. Can I ask for your thoughts on that, on the Great Reset, and whether or not you really believe that this is the Great Reset?
I think you make a very strong case. And if you look at the World Economic Forum and Davos and Bill Gates and all these people and George Soros, it strongly looks like a global conspiracy. There's no doubt about it. And of course, if you look at who makes out of it, big pharma and the big organizations, when you crush small organizations, it takes away the competition. So yes, you have a point. Now, here's an interesting thing which I'll share with you. I have been an investment banker broadly for most of my life, and sometimes soldier, but mainly mainly investment banker. I only went into politics, for a wee while, for 10 years, and that was very much focused on Brexit, as you know. So I lived cheek by jowl with politicians for 10 years in committee, in Brussels, actually in Westminster, as a member of certain committees. I have never met such a bunch of stupid people in my entire life. I cannot tell you how stupid these people are. And I came from, admittedly, an investment bank where everybody around me was Oxbridge or Heidelberg or the Sorbonne and spoke 15 languages. They were all unbelievably clever people. But then, I go into the Wheat Sheaf, my local pub, and it's got the joiner, the butcher, the sparky in there. And they're all miles more intelligent and better informed than any of the politicians I met when I was in Brussels or indeed Westminster. These people are incredibly stupid. So they're not clever enough to be part of a conspiracy. Let me put it that way. They're not clever enough to be part of a conspiracy. They just don't have any brain power. But of course, what we didn't quite know is who's actually pulling the strings. We don't know who they are beholden to, and we don't know who's bought them. We know that most of people like Bill Gates have bought into most of the newspapers. And if they don't own shares in the newspapers quite big time, they own a very big slice of what goes on in the World Health Organization. We know that Sky is owned now, Sky UK, not Sky Australia, is owned by a left-wing group in Canada. We know that American TV and radio, in the main, with the exception of Fox, has been hijacked by the left. We know there's a global agenda. We know that the BBC were hostile. Every man jack of anybody in the BBC and Sky and Channel 4 hated the idea of Brexit. So we know that mainstream media, we know that deep state, as the Americans would call it, and what we used to call here the establishment, is following some sort of agenda. Now, whether that's coordinated and whether people like Boris even understand he's being manipulated, it begs the question, does Boris understand he's being manipulated? And who's manipulating him? Is it his girlfriend? Because we know, do we not, that coronavirus is joined at the hip with climate change. So we know we're all having to put up with this hypothesis that man-made carbon dioxide is going to cause apocalyptic climate change, which we know not to be true. We know that's a failed hypothesis. There is no correlation between man-made hypothesis, CO2, and climate, or indeed there is no historic correlation between carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We know that. We can go back to the Minoan War period. So we know the hypothesis is crazy, which they won't have it debated. We're not allowed to debate climate change on mainstream media. You're allowed to bring on a wee Swedish pixie, a teenager who doesn't know anything about it, and give her plenty of airtime. Who's not allowed on? Professor Ian Plimer, one of the world's most foremost climate scientists, who's based in Australia. Professor Plimer is absolutely brilliant on climate, but he's not allowed on. He's not allowed on. So we all now receive wisdom that electric cars are going to save the planet, for example. I mean, where do they think the electricity comes from when they plug it in? You get home in the evening, you plug your car in, your electric car. Where do they think it comes from? You know, these guys haven't a clue. And there's been no cost benefit analysis to net zero carbon, has there? Nobody knows about this. So yes, but these rules and regulations come internationally now. They're UN sanctioned. We used to think it was just the EU, but those days have now passed. This is about international organizations, which are fabulously funded by people like George Soros and Bill Gates, and they are calling the shots. I mean, you've only got to look at Matt Hancock to see he's virtually retarded. I mean, it's not him that's running a conspiracy. It can't be. It's behind the scenes, and probably some people whose names we don't even know. Don't even know them.
Thank you very much, Godfrey. You're like a breath of fresh air to all of us. Richard Day, I think you wanted to ask another question, did you? Could you come off mute? Could you come off mute?
Yeah, I'm unmuted now. Okay. Yeah. Right, Godfrey. Just to go back on a couple of points that you made, and libertarianism as well. We are, you know, when you speak of libertarianism, it can defend us against an overzealous government, if you like. But what we're facing now, and I was reading an article today published by the Bureau of Investigative Journalists. It's regarding the corporate control that we are now levered under, which governments are now levered under, and this article explained the blackmailing and the bullying of smaller countries' governments like Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, Argentina, Brazil, Panama, and Peru by Pfizer. And this article relates to the liability if anything should go wrong with their vaccine. Now, what they were basically doing, first of all, they tried to get the Argentinian government to take financial liability should anything go wrong with Pfizer's vaccine. And the negotiations got so heated, and Pfizer was so aggressive in the negotiations that they actually wanted Argentinian assets, physical assets, embassy building, lands the country owned in other countries, military bases, other money in the banks that they had as well, precious metals. It was absolutely preposterous. The leverage that Pfizer are putting over some of the governments of these foreign countries. We're not just facing a global government, in fact, it's a corporatocracy. I can't say it, a corporatocracy, where, you know, Pfizer being the leading ones with this pandemic at the moment. But it looks like we might be answering to Pfizer in the near future rather than our government. So the likes of Sunak, Goldman Sachs, Rishi Sunak, he's basically, you know, they're touting him as an ex-prime minister. He's basically corporate owned. We're now going to, you know, we've got out of the EU. We're not just fighting the Conservative government or Boris. We're fighting the corporations. I wonder what your views were on that, because they're running away with it. People just don't realise the control our governments are giving to these corporations, and I think this pandemic is basically the horse they're riding into town with.
Yes, of course, that's absolutely right. So you have, we are, for example, we are bound in the United Kingdom as signatories to the World Health Organization to do what they tell us. It's a legal requirement, which most people don't know, but it's a legal requirement under our terms of membership of the WHO. The WHO has been sponsored by Big Pharma for decades, I'll give you a little example of this, for example. This is, you may or may know this, not know this. For example, when it came to diabetes, the figure 10, the factor 10, used to be the old, or 12 was the old benchmark if you were going to be confirmed as diabetic 2. Now, the World Health Organization pressured governments to reduce that to factor 10. Excuse me. They reduced that to factor 10. That put nearly 1 billion people on metformin. That meant metformin was prescribed for nearly 1 billion people globally, which made them an absolute fortune. So, yes, they don't actually have to front it up. It doesn't have to be Pfizer or AstraZeneca or Smith and Nephew that go and do this. They use, the reason they fund these things is because these people go along and they do it for them. And of course, therefore, in the main, populations and the electorate of the Western Hemisphere in particular, who are particularly naive, go along and say, oh, the World Health Organization says this is a good idea, or the United Nations think this is a good idea. And you'll find the average politician will go with it because it saves him having to think. And it makes a very interesting or easy response to somebody from the question, if it's question time, the floor says, oh, it's an EU, it's a EU directive, or it's a UN directive, or it's a WHO directive. But right, that's how they do it. I've written an article, I've written a long article, it comes in 3 parts on my website, on how I believe the technocracy, if it were, is overtaking the world, and how they do it and why they do it and how they manipulate statistics. It's on my website. It was originally published by Going Postal. It's about, it's in 3 parts, and it's my hypothesis on how, why, and what they're actually up to. It was published just before Christmas. I'm interested to any feedback on that, but you are absolutely right. And of course, if you add to that, the endorsement of the CIA, who now call the shots for the neocons in Washington, and they now have complete power over some countries, even Commonwealth countries. You try and trade, for example, with Iran through a New Zealand bank account, and you'll find that you get arrested in New Zealand, your bank account closed because the CIA in Washington don't like it. This runs far deeper, and it's Boris doesn't have any power. Hancock doesn't have any power. They're just the puppets. They're the little puppets in front of everybody. The real power is behind the scenes. And of course, it's interesting, is it not? If you know Michael Yeadon, somebody will be, some of you may have seen the relatively recently retired vice president of Pfizer's, basically saying, don't trust Pfizer. They're a bunch of bloody crooks. And if you talk about Goldman Sachs, which is known in the city, even when I was there working for the Warburg Empire, as the vampire squid. So we know that Carney came from Goldman Sachs. We know that the Chancellor came from Goldman Sachs. We know that Barroso, the President of the European Commission, went to Goldman Sachs. You know, who recommended the Greeks joined the euro in 2002-3? Goldman Sachs. They cooked the books. This runs really, really deep. You're quite right.
Thank you very much, Godfrey. There was somebody else that wanted. Oh, Richard Day. Sorry, did you want to come back?
No, he's answered the question. I won't hog it. Thank you, Godfrey.
Thank you very much, Godfrey. And Mike Shaw wanted to ask something again. Can you come off mute, Mike Shaw?
No, I didn't ask another question.
Oh, your hand was up. Sorry.
Oh, I meant to put that down. Very sorry.
Oh, okay. Jeff, did you have your hand up to ask a question? I think we lost Jeff. I don't know if Richard Brain wants to ask a question.
Fine.
Richard here, our last elected leader. Richard, do you want to ask something? Richard? Richard? Something's gone wrong with Richard's internet, I think.
Yeah, I am unmuted.
Oh, okay, Jeff. Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, what I've been wondering about for some time is, I mean, I'm one for very low taxes and everything, but is if there's no taxes paid to the government or to the local council and that, yeah, how do we cover services like maintaining roads or even things like defence? You know, you can't shut everything down. So where would the money come from if everybody decided they're not going to pay any tax at all?
Well, roads, you have a road tax, or what used to be called a road fund license, don't you? And it's a little sticker, used to be a sticker on your windscreen. And if they spent what motorists spend on their road fund license, there would be almost twice as much money for roads. And so people could say, I'm quite happy to have a tax disc on my car, so I can use the roads.
Yeah.
But the money would have to go on the roads, not embezzled. All right. Let's talk about defence. You mentioned defence, but you see, we're spending somewhere in the region of £53 billion a year on defence. Where does it go? We have 2 aircraft carriers in the South China Sea. Well, that's not protecting us at all. Where's the invasion coming from? France, in small boats to Dover. The Navy's in the South China Sea. So what are we paying for? We're not paying for anything. It's rubbish. So we always, when it comes through taxation, it's rubbish. When you talk about the council, if we didn't pay the council, well, who'd empty our bins? Somebody would soon knock on the door and say, would you want your bins emptied? We'll charge you £10 a month. Yeah, that would be great. I'm paying £2,500 a year in rates, and all we get is our bins emptied. It's absolutely appalling. It's appalling. We're not getting anything. If they left us more money, as I said, if you could have your money untaxed, you could buy whatever service you wanted to do quite easily and a lot cheaper.
Yeah.
Yeah, that does make sense, Godfrey. Jeff, does that answer your question?
Yeah, well, with a road fund licence, it's still a tax, isn't it?
No, but it used to be a tax, I guess. I don't know.
Well, no, what I'm saying is, it's the money. If you pay the road fund license, what it used to be is the road fund license. Let's call it the road fund license. If you paid your £100 a year or your £150 a year for that, you have your sticker. That money is ring fenced. It has to go on the roads. We'd all be better off. That's not what happens now. If you add what we spend in duty on petrol, VAT buying a car, and road fund license, if you add that, 50% of it finds its way, only 50% of it finds its way to the road. The rest of it's taken away. That's the problem with tax. It's stolen. It's always intercepted and stolen. I'd be quite happy to just a minute. You've got to bear in mind that the great road system and rail system wasn't built by the state in this country. All the railways and all the roads were built by private enterprise, and not the state. The state didn't provide anything. The state's just taken it over and say, oh, you use the roads, don't you? In that case, we're going to tax you. But they don't spend the money on the roads. That's the whole point of my argument.
Yeah, I have to agree with you, because I pay tax, national insurance for donkey's years, and I take very, very little out of the system. And it does make me angry the way the government wastes my money. Karen wanted to ask a question, actually. She had her hand up for quite a long time. Karen?
Yes, hi. So we have now really discussed how bad our situation is with the oligarchs running the world, and clearly all governments wanting to import more migrants, more third world migrants. And what are we going to do? I mean, we don't even have a party to campaign for. What can we do?
It's very difficult politically, isn't it? Because I can't see in who's interested in to let this continue. Now, I've done a video on this on my website. There's a video on how we could deal with it, and it just take a couple of minutes to explain. For a start, these people coming across from France, first of all, they're not coming from war-torn countries, they're coming from France. Now, it is part of the French strategy to dump them on our coastline. It's endorsed by the French. They're deliberately doing this. The first thing we need to do is understand that the French are deliberately doing this. Now, when I was attached to the Royal Air Force Regiment in Afghanistan, they had a piece of equipment which is called Sniper. I think it's built by the Israelis. You can see a man from 20,000 feet running along a mountain track in the dark. That's how unbelievable this piece of kit is. So we know that we could find these boats setting off from the French coast. And before they've got more than 50 or 100 yards from the tow, then we could send Royal Naval tugs and Marines to tow them back. You could do this for a very small amount of money. Very small amount. This doesn't cost anything. What costs an absolute fortune is useless white elephant aircraft carriers in the South China Sea, where they've no business. That's what we need to do. We need to bring it back. What are we going to do with all these people who are mainly young men from third world countries who don't share our culture, who hang around in groups, in gangs? What are we going to do about this? And the question is, you're quite right. Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, has done nothing. This government's done nothing. They're still coming at this time of the year. What the summer's going to be like, I really don't know. They're now making accommodation for them permanent. They've been in hotels and now it's permanent. So we got this problem that clearly the government regard them as here to stay. Now, I'm not anti-immigration, you see. I'm married into a Polish family. But they came up, my father-in-law finished up here at the end of the war. He's part of 1st Polish Armored Division. Most East Europeans come over here to work and they work very hard. They come here to contribute to the economy. But the people coming in from these third world countries aren't. They're coming here because we have the most liberal and ridiculous handout welfare systems on the face of the planet. And they will continue to come until we stop doing it. And we need to put them in very uncomfortable camps indeed, but they can elect to go home whenever they like, and we will ship them all home. And they get 1 meal a day, just enough to keep body and soul together in the camp. The camps are guarded and they can't come out. And they'd soon get on their phones. Isn't it funny? They've all got a phone, haven't they? They've all got a phone, and they can phone their mates in France. Don't come here. It's bloody awful. Let's all go back to Germany.
But our government and anybody, Labour, of course, being even worse, just don't want to do it. It's probably part of the huge agenda. They just want to get them in, to have more cheap labor and also more consumers.
Well, you see, Theresa May signed up to this. The United Nations, come in, come one all.
Migration compact.
But this is the point, and I try and make the point when I used to do lots of BBC interviews. With BBC interviews, they don't come to work. They come for the welfare. None of these people work. Okay. If you look at people coming from the third world in the last decade, almost none of them are working. Why would they? They've got 4 kids. They make more money not working. Now, if you look at the immigration to the United States in the last century, in the century before that, everybody was there going to build a life. They were going to build a life for themselves. Immigrations, my father-in-law came with absolutely nothing, leaving the Polish army in 1945, made himself a millionaire, put 2 children through public school. He came here to work. There's a work ethic. There's a huge work ethic with these people. The people coming in at the moment to Dover don't have a work ethic. They're not interested in working. And the weird thing is they're not allowed to work. Under the system we have, they're not allowed to work. What kind of system is that? And they land and they can't work and we can't send them back. We just give them hotel accommodation. Madness.
Yeah, I think we'd all agree with that. Thank you, Godfrey. There's one more question from Alan Shipman, who's not asked a question yet. Alan, did you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you, Janice. Hi, Godfrey. Good to hear your voice again. It's been a long time.
Hi, Alan.
First of all, I'd like to compliment you on your shirt. It's brilliant.
It's a bit sudden, isn't it? It's a bit sudden.
No, it's similar to mine. That's why. We've had private chats in other groups and things, and we've got a problem that we're mostly politically homeless. What's your thoughts on all that at the moment and the way that what happened to UKIP? Do you think that could have happened while you were still there?
Well, the problem with UKIP is that it started out with one goal, which was Brexit, obviously. And in the constitution, it was a libertarian party, low tax, really sort of what would have been the Conservative Party of Lord Salisbury, as I mentioned earlier. And that was UKIP. And that was fine. And the grassroots people, let me just say this now. I never met a finer bunch of people than I met in UKIP at grassroots level, out in the wind and the cold and handing up when it was no hope. When it was no hope, there was no chance of us ever getting Brexit at the early days, 30 years ago. There were true patriots, really wonderful people. And as soon as we started to get successful, people I didn't know started turning up at head office. I didn't know who they were. And they were on wages. And I had Yorkshire UKIP members scratching around for £15 a year membership, trying to scratch it together. And there were people at head office on 50 grand a year. Steve Crowther, the chairman. What happened to Steve Crowther? He was clearly a government plant. Crowther was obviously working for MI5. Bloody obvious to everybody, except Nigel Farage, who recruited him in the pub. You can't run a political party on a one-man band like that. It was doomed to failure. So as soon as we got the agreement to a referendum, the party collapsed, and it was collapsed quite deliberately by the hierarchy, not by the membership. Not by the membership. They were as keen as that they ever were. No, it was collapsed from the top. And I left because I had the whip suspended for a fortnight. But my original resignation was a year before that. I didn't like the way it was going. I didn't like Crowther. I didn't like the people who were climbing on the bandwagon. There was a whiff of ermine. People thought, oh, we might get seats in the House of Lords. We might get some knighthoods. And all the wrong people got to the top of UKIP. Never were good people so badly led as they were. And it was quite appalling. But you see, with the political party, they're all hijacked. The Conservative Party's been hijacked. It's been hijacked. These comedians run in the cabinet aren't Conservatives. In the same way, the Labour Party would say the comedians running the Labour Party have got nothing to do with what they should be, is looking out for white working class people. They don't do that. Keir Starmer has nothing in common with the average Joe Chippy or ordinary working guy in a pub. Doesn't like him, doesn't know him, doesn't want him, doesn't talk to him. These people are ghastly. I think the only way we could make headway is where we did under the system, proportional representation. That's what got UKIP the deal. It was that people didn't waste their vote. And at the referendum, of course, Alan, the number of people, it would have been the same with you, that told me on the street they haven't voted for years, but now they were going to vote because they felt it would make a difference. And it did make a difference.
It counted. It actually counted that time.
Most people don't vote now because it doesn't matter. Yeah. And they vote against, don't they? They vote to keep out one party. They don't vote for somebody, they vote against that party. And I think that was never thus. Now, with proportional representation, I could get elected on that basis, as I was for Yorkshire, with 400,000 votes from a standing start in 8 years. Because everybody voted for me up here in Yorkshire for the simple reason they like the truth up in Yorkshire. They like it delivered honestly to them, and that's what I did. And
I don't think they even voted for people. I think they voted, for something different. I found myself over the years, I voted Labour, I voted Conservative, but I voted for Tony Blair to get rid of John Major. I voted for David Cameron to get rid of Gordon Brown and Tony Blair. And that's what I think a lot of people do is, it changed with the referendum and with UKIP at the 15 election, because there was actually a good chance that we could have something different. I completely agree with what you're saying there.
Yeah, but you're quite right. It's just one of those sad things. But, we got Brexit. Eventually, we'll probably get a government. Maybe somebody will come back and actually run the country properly when we lose the comedians in power at the moment. At least we can sack these people. At least we can sack them. We couldn't sack the people that were running the country before. We could sack this lot, and I hope we do.
Yeah, thank you, Godfrey. Would you mind taking one more question, or do you have to rush off?
Just the last, because I'm badly pressed.
I know. Thank you. So, Mike Farish has been waiting to ask one more question. So go ahead, please, Mike.
Godfrey.
Just a quick question.
Yeah, very quick question. I want to. Despite all the things you described about UKIP, we did get Brexit, do you think we actually got a worthwhile Brexit? And what lessons, you mentioned proportional representation, and what lessons can we draw from the Brexit campaign about how we go forward from here?
Well, I was basically a founder member of UKIP, which was 30 years ago. And I have to say one thing, and that is, if you'd said to me, would you settle in 2019? Would you settle for what we've got now? I would have said yes. I would have said yes, because this is the first step. Brexit isn't the final. Brexit is the first step to get our country back and our country sorted out. So the answer is yes. Is this a good Brexit? No, it's a terrible Brexit. It's rubbish, but it's a whole heap better than it might have been a few years ago. So I'm just hoping that the European Union shoot themselves in the foot. They're behaving in the most extraordinary way. And a lot of people who voted to Remain are going, I didn't realize how awful these people were. And of course, the longer we go, and there isn't Armageddon, we have got stuff in our shops. Nothing's ground to a halt because we're no longer members of the people go, the fear factor will have gone. So there will be no chances of ever voting to go back in. So the answer is yes. It's okay. I would have liked a much crisper. No deal was the best deal, Mike. No deal was the best deal. But anyway, we've got what we've got, and proportional representation does at least show that I would say there are probably 5 or 6 million adults in this country disenfranchised, who have no natural political home. And with proportional representation, we could give them back their vote. So I think proportional representation would be great. Are we going to get it? No, because we're not going to get it. What government changes a political system that put them in power?
Yeah. Well, Godfrey, I can't thank you enough for the time that you've given to us. It's been really enlightening, and thank you for sharing all your knowledge. And I think there's probably not much that you've said that any of us would disagree with. And I hope that you will come back and talk to us again sometime in the future. We've really enjoyed it. Do you think you might come back again?
I would be delighted. And my very best wishes to all of you down there. And, and let's think about the good times. And it was successful. We were successful in UKIP. It was good. We mustn't look too darkly at that. We've got not the best deal, admittedly. And UKIP was betrayed by its hierarchy. But we must look on the bright side. And we did well. And everybody in UKIP in those early days in particular can hold their heads up.
Are you a member of any particular political party now?
No, and I won't be. I had to promise my wife after the knife went into the hilt in between my shoulder blades at UKIP. She said, "You're never joining another political party because they're a bunch of absolute bastards," and I never will. But that I have, and I'm actually doing a lot better on my own. I have a social media following of around about 100,000 a week.
Wow.
So I'm doing a lot better. I'm doing a lot better without being attached to a political party. So I'm going to continue to plough my own little furrow.
What is your website address, Godfrey?
Oh yes, certainly. It's easy. It's godfreybloom.uk.
Okay.
That's how I found you. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I will send that out on email. And you're on Are you on Facebook? I know you're on Twitter. Are you on Facebook as well?
I am on Facebook.